The wagon wheel hit a rut in the dirt road outside Desdemona, Texas, and the woman in the back let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, her body jolting against the rough wooden boards that had carried her this far and might not carry her much farther if the blood soaking through her dress meant what Thomas Whitmore thought it meant. Thomas heard that sound from where he stood in the doorway of his small cabin, a half-mile from the main road, and something in it made him set down the saddle he had been mending and walk toward the wagon that was slowing now, the driver pulling the horses to a halt with hands that shook visibly, even from a distance. The afternoon sun beat down on the Texas landscape with the kind of heat that made everything shimmer and waver, turning the world into something uncertain and dreamlike. But the blood on that woman was real enough, dark and wet against the pale fabric of what had once been a fine traveling dress. "Please," the driver called out, an older man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. "Please, sir, is there a doctor in these parts? This woman, she needs help. Bandits hit us about 10 miles back, killed her husband and the other passengers. I barely got away and she is hurt bad." Thomas moved faster then, his boots kicking up dust as he covered the distance to the wagon. He had been a cowboy for most of his 32 years, working ranches across Texas and Oklahoma territory, and he had seen plenty of blood and violence in his time. But he had also seen enough death to know when someone was close to crossing that line. And this woman with her pale face and the way her breathing came in shallow, pained gasps, was dancing right on the edge. "Nearest doctor is in town, and that is a 2-hour ride," Thomas said, looking at the woman properly now. She was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and tumbled around her shoulders. Her eyes were closed, but her face was twisted in pain. "She would not make it. Bring her inside. I have some skill with wounds." The driver looked relieved and desperate all at once. "God bless you, mister. I did not know what else to do. Name is Albert Jessup, and I was taking the stage from Fort Worth to Abilene when those devils came out of nowhere." Together, they lifted the woman from the wagon bed as carefully as they could, though she still cried out when they moved her, a sound that cut through Thomas like a knife. He had been alone in this cabin for 3 years now, ever since he left the cattle drives behind, and tried to make something resembling a life for himself on this small piece of land. The silence had been both a comfort and a curse, and now it was broken by this woman's pain, by the reality of another human being who needed something from him. They got her inside and onto his bed, the only real piece of furniture he owned besides a table and 2 chairs. The cabin was small and spare, just one room with a fireplace and a few shelves, but it was clean and it was shelter, and right now that was what mattered. "What is her name?" Thomas asked as he grabbed a basin and filled it with water from the pitcher by the door. "Zara Gallagher," Albert said. "She and her husband were heading west to start fresh. He was a banker, I think. Good people. Did not deserve what happened." Thomas knelt beside the bed and began to carefully peel away the fabric of her dress where the blood was worst. There was a bullet wound in her side, just above her hip, and another graze along her shoulder. The shoulder was not so bad, but the one in her side had gone deep, and he could see that she had lost a lot of blood. "I need you to go into town," Thomas said to Albert, not looking up from his examination. "Get the doctor, bring him back here. Even if I can stop the bleeding, she needs better care than I can give." Albert nodded quickly. "I will go right now. You will stay with her." "I am not going anywhere," Thomas said, and he meant it. There was something about this woman, even in her broken state, that made him feel a pull he had not felt in years. Maybe it was just the human need to help someone in pain. Or maybe it was something more, but either way, he knew he could not leave her. Albert left, the sound of the wagon wheels fading into the distance, and Thomas was alone with Zara Gallagher and the sound of her labored breathing. He worked quickly, using the skills he had learned over years of patching up cowboys and horses, and even himself on occasion. He cleaned the wounds as best he could, using whiskey to sterilize them and trying not to think about how much it must hurt when she cried out and her body went rigid with pain. "I am sorry," he murmured, though he was not sure she could even hear him. "I know it hurts. But I have to get this clean or infection will kill you faster than the bullet would have." Her eyes fluttered open then, just for a moment, and they were the color of storm clouds, gray and deep and full of something that might have been fear or might have been defiance. She looked at him, really looked at him, and then she whispered something so quiet he almost missed it. "Let me die." Thomas froze, his hand still on the bandage he was wrapping around her torso. "What did you say?" "Let me die," she repeated, and this time there was no mistaking it. "He is gone." "What is the point?" Something in Thomas's chest twisted at those words, at the raw despair in them. He understood that feeling, had felt it himself more times than he cared to count. The loneliness of the frontier, the way it could strip a person down to nothing, leave them wondering what the hell they were fighting for. "The point," he said slowly, tying off the bandage and looking her straight in the eyes, "is that you are still alive. And as long as you are alive, there is a chance for something better. I know you do not believe that right now, but I am asking you to trust me." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the battle happening behind those gray eyes. Then she closed them again, and her breathing evened out just a little, and Thomas took that as acceptance, or at least as the absence of resistance. He stayed by her side as the afternoon bled into evening, changing the bandages when they soaked through, giving her water when she was conscious enough to drink, and talking to her even when she did not respond. He told her about the cabin, about how he had built it with his own hands after years of drifting. He told her about the cattle drives, about sleeping under the stars and waking up with frost on his bedroll. He told her things he had not told anyone in years, because the silence of the cabin had made him forget how to talk to people. And now that there was someone here, even someone half-conscious and broken, the words just kept coming. "I know what it is like to feel like there is nothing left," he said, as the last light faded from the sky and he lit the oil lamp on the table. "I felt that way when my family died, when the fever took my parents and my sister, all in the span of a week. I was 18 years old and suddenly alone in the world. I thought about giving up more times than I can count, but something kept me going, some stubborn part of me that refused to quit. And eventually, I found reasons to keep living. Small reasons, maybe, but they were enough." Zara's eyes opened again, and this time there was a clarity in them that had not been there before. "What reasons?" she asked, her voice still weak but steadier than it had been. Thomas thought about that for a moment. "The sunrise, a good horse, coffee that is hot and strong. The way the wind sounds in the grass. I know those sound like small things, and they are. But sometimes the small things are what keep us going until we can find the bigger things again." She was quiet after that, but he thought maybe she was listening, really listening. He kept talking, kept telling her stories, and somewhere in the middle of the night, she fell into a deeper sleep that looked more natural than the pain-induced unconsciousness she had been in before. Thomas dozed in the chair beside the bed, waking every hour or so to check on her, to make sure she was still breathing and that the bleeding had not started again. By the time the sun rose on a new day, he was exhausted but cautiously hopeful. She had made it through the night, and that was something. The doctor arrived around mid-morning, brought by Albert Jessup, who looked as tired as Thomas felt. Dr. Emerson was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a no-nonsense manner that Thomas appreciated. He examined Zara thoroughly, cleaned and re-bandaged her wounds with supplies from his bag, and then stood back with a considering look on his face. "You did good work," he said to Thomas. "She would have died if you had not stopped the bleeding when you did. As it is, she has a fighting chance. The next few days will be critical. She needs rest, fluids, and someone to watch for signs of fever or infection. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded without hesitation. "I can do that." The doctor gave him instructions, left some supplies, and then departed with Albert, who promised to send word to any family Zara might have had. Thomas watched them go and then turned back to the cabin. To the woman lying in his bed who had come into his life on a wave of blood and violence, and who had, in the span of less than 24 hours, given him something he had not had in a long time, a purpose. Over the next few days, Thomas tended to Zara with a care and attention that surprised even himself. He had always been good with animals, patient and gentle, and he found that those same qualities served him well now. He changed her bandages, helped her drink water and broth, and talked to her when she was awake enough to listen. She did not say much at first, just watched him with those storm cloud eyes, but slowly, as the pain eased and her strength began to return, she started to talk back. Small things at first, answering his questions about how she felt, whether she was hungry, if she needed anything. But then, on the fourth day, she asked him a question that made him pause in the middle of spooning broth into her mouth. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not know me." "I am nothing to you." Thomas set the bowl down and looked at her, really looked at her. The color was starting to come back to her face, and her eyes were clearer than they had been. She was beautiful, he realized, in a way that had nothing to do with perfect features and everything to do with the strength he could see in her, the resilience that had kept her alive when by all rights she should have died on that road. "Maybe that is exactly why," he said slowly. "Because you are not nothing to me. You are a person who needed help, and I was in a position to give it. And maybe because I have been alone too long, and forgotten what it feels like to have someone else in the world who depends on me." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her turning his words over in her mind. Then she said quietly, "I heard what you said, that first night, about mending." Thomas felt his face heat up, embarrassed that she had heard his rambling. "I talk too much when I am nervous." "No," she said, and there was something almost fierce in her voice. "No, you were right, I am broken. This," she gestured weakly at her bandaged side, "is just the part you can see. But the rest of me is broken too. My husband is dead. The life we were building is gone. I do not know who I am without him." Thomas reached out without thinking and took her hand, her fingers small and cold in his. "Then maybe we can figure that out together. I am pretty broken myself, if we are being honest. 3 years in this cabin, barely talking to anyone, just going through the motions of living without really being alive. Maybe we can mend each other." She looked at their joined hands, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "I do not even know your name." "Thomas Whitmore," he said. "Folks used to call me Tom back when there were folks who called me anything." "Thomas," she repeated like she was testing the weight of it. "That is a good name, solid." "And you are Zara Gallagher," he said. "The driver told me." "Just Zara," she said. "Gallagher was his name. I do not know if I want to keep it." Thomas understood that, the need to shed the past like a snake sheds its skin. "Zara it is, then." She smiled at him, just a small thing, barely there, but it felt like a victory. As the days turned into weeks, Zara grew stronger. Thomas helped her sit up, then stand, then take her first shaky steps around the cabin. It was slow going, and there were setbacks, days when the pain was too much and she had to stay in bed, but gradually she improved. And as her body healed, Thomas began to see glimpses of who she had been before the attack, or maybe who she was becoming now. She was sharp-witted, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard the first time she used it. She had been a schoolteacher before marrying her husband, and she had a way of explaining things that made even complicated ideas seem simple. She loved to read, and Thomas found himself riding into Desdemona to borrow books from the small lending library there, just to see her face light up when he brought them back. And she was curious about him, asking questions about his life, his past, his hopes for the future. It had been so long since anyone had cared enough to ask that Thomas found himself opening up in ways he had not expected. He told her about the cattle drives, the good times and the bad. He told her about the men he had worked with, the friendships that had been forged over campfires and long days in the saddle. He told her about the violence too, the fights and the rustlers and the harsh justice of the frontier, and she listened without judgment. "You miss it?" she asked one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape. She was sitting in the one chair he had brought outside, wrapped in a blanket even though the evening was warm, and he was on the ground beside her, his back against the cabin wall. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I miss the camaraderie, the feeling of being part of something. But I do not miss the loneliness of it, the way you could be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. I thought settling here would be different, but it turns out you can be just as lonely in a cabin by yourself." "Until a bleeding woman shows up in a wagon," Zara said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice. Thomas laughed, a real laugh that felt rusty from disuse. "Until then, yes." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I was lonely too, you know, in my marriage. Henry was a good man and I cared for him, but we did not have what you would call a love match. It was practical. He wanted a wife, I wanted security. We were content, I suppose, but not happy." "Not really." Thomas looked up at her, surprised by the admission. "Why are you telling me this?" She met his eyes, and there was something vulnerable in her expression that made his breath catch. "Because I do not want to lie to you. I do not want you to think I am some tragic widow mourning the love of her life. I am sad that he died, and I wish it had not happened, but I am not broken because I lost him. I am broken because I realized, lying in that wagon, that I had spent so much of my life settling for less than I deserved. And I do not want to do that anymore." Thomas did not know what to say to that, so he just reached up and took her hand again, the way he had that first day, and she held on tight. The weeks turned into months, and somewhere along the way, Thomas realized that he had stopped thinking of Zara as a patient or even as a guest. She was just Zara, the woman who shared his cabin and his meals and his life. She helped with the chores as she grew stronger, cooking and mending and keeping the cabin in a state of cleanliness that it had never known when he lived alone. And he found himself working harder on the small piece of land he owned, trying to make it into something more than just a place to survive, trying to make it into a home. They fell into a rhythm, an easy companionship that felt natural and right. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Thomas told her about his family, about the sister who had loved to sing and the parents who had worked themselves to the bone trying to provide for their children. Zara told him about growing up in a small town in Missouri, about the schoolhouse where she had taught and the students she had loved. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them quite noticed it happening, they began to heal each other in ways that had nothing to do with bandages and medicine. It was a warm evening in late summer, nearly 3 months after the wagon had brought Zara to his doorstep, when things between them shifted in a way that could not be ignored. They were sitting outside again, watching the stars come out, and Zara was telling him about a book she had just finished, her voice animated and her hands moving as she talked. Thomas was not really listening to the words, though. He was watching her face, the way her eyes sparkled in the lamplight, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when it fell forward. And he realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he was in love with her. It was not something that had happened all at once. It was 1,000 small moments, 1,000 kindnesses and conversations and shared silences. It was the way she laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. It was the way she had learned to make coffee just the way he liked it, strong and black and hot enough to burn. It was the way she looked at him sometimes, like he was someone worth looking at, someone who mattered. He must have gone quiet because she stopped talking and looked at him with concern. "Thomas, are you all right?" He could have lied. He could have made up some excuse, said he was tired or not feeling well. But he had spent too much of his life holding back, keeping his feelings locked away where they could not hurt him, and he was tired of it. "I am in love with you," he said, the words coming out rough and unpolished but honest. "I know I should not be. I know you have been through hell and the last thing you need is me complicating things, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore. I love you, Zara. I think I have loved you since that first day, when you looked at me and asked me to let you die, and I knew I would do anything to keep you alive." Zara stared at him, her eyes wide and her lips parted in surprise. For a long moment she did not say anything, and Thomas felt his heart sink, felt the familiar weight of rejection settling over him. But then she smiled, and it was like the sun coming out after a storm. "You foolish man," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I have been in love with you for weeks. I just did not think you felt the same way." Thomas felt like he had been punched in the chest, but in the best possible way. "You love me." "Of course I love you," she said, and now there were tears running down her face, but she was still smiling. "How could I not? You saved my life. You took care of me when I had no one. You talked to me like I mattered, like my thoughts and feelings were important. You made me laugh when I thought I would never laugh again. You gave me a reason to keep living." Thomas stood up then, crossing the distance between them in 2 long strides, and knelt in front of her chair. He took both her hands in his and looked up at her, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. "Then marry me," he said. "I know it is too soon. I know you need time to grieve and heal, but I want you to know that I am here, that I am not going anywhere, and that whenever you are ready, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Zara laughed through her tears, and it was the most beautiful sound Thomas had ever heard. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. Not because I need security or because I am looking for someone to take care of me, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you. A real life, the kind I always dreamed of but never thought I would have." Thomas pulled her down then, out of the chair and into his arms, and he kissed her with all the pent-up longing and love he had been holding inside. She kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands tangling in his hair, and for a long moment, the world consisted of nothing but the two of them and the promise of a future they would build together. They were married a month later in Desdemona, in a small ceremony attended by the doctor who had saved her life, the stage driver who had brought her to Thomas, and a handful of townspeople who had heard their story and wanted to be part of it. Zara wore a simple blue dress that Thomas had bought for her in town, and he wore his best shirt and the new vest she had made for him, stitching it by hand in the evenings while he worked on expanding the cabin. The preacher was an old circuit rider named Reverend Powell, a man with kind eyes and a voice that could fill a church or carry across the open prairie. He spoke about love and second chances, about how God worked in mysterious ways and sometimes brought people together in the most unexpected circumstances. "Thomas and Zara," he said, looking at them with warmth in his gaze, "you have both known loss and pain. You have both walked through the valley of the shadow of death. But you have found each other, and in finding each other, you have found a reason to hope again. Marriage is not always easy. It takes work and patience and forgiveness. But when it is built on a foundation of love and respect, as yours clearly is, it can weather any storm. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Zara like she was the most precious thing in the world, because to him, she was. And when they walked out of the small church into the bright Texas sunshine, hand in hand, he felt like he was walking into a new life, one that was full of possibility and promise. They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. The cabin was too small for two people, so Thomas spent the fall expanding it, adding a second room and a proper porch where they could sit in the evenings. Zara helped when she could, handing him tools and holding boards steady while he hammered, and they worked together in a companionable silence that spoke of deep comfort and trust. The land around the cabin was not much, just a few acres of scrubby grass and hard, packed dirt, but Thomas had dreams of making it into something more. He bought a few head of cattle with money he had saved from his cowboy days, and Zara suggested they plant a garden, something that would give them fresh vegetables and maybe a little extra to sell in town. "I know it is not much," Thomas said one evening as they surveyed their small homestead, his arm around her waist, "but I want to build something here, something that is ours." Zara leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "It is already ours," she said softly. "And it is more than I ever hoped for. A home, a husband who loves me, a chance to start over. That is everything." The first winter was hard, as winters on the Texas plains often were. The cold was bitter and the wind was relentless, and there were days when they barely left the cabin, huddled by the fireplace and wrapped in every blanket they owned. But even the hardship of winter could not dampen their happiness. They spent those long, dark evenings talking and reading aloud to each other, and Thomas taught Zara to play poker with a worn deck of cards he had carried for years. She beat him more often than not, and he loved the way her eyes lit up when she won. In the spring, the garden began to flourish under Zara's care, and Thomas's small herd of cattle grew. They made trips into Desdemona once or twice a month, selling eggs and vegetables and buying supplies, and gradually they became part of the community. People who had heard their story were curious at first, but Zara's warmth and intelligence won them over quickly, and Thomas found himself making friends for the first time in years. Life was not perfect. There were struggles and setbacks, times when money was tight or the weather turned against them. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. It was in the early summer, nearly a year after they had married, that Zara told Thomas she was expecting a child. They were in the garden, and she had been quiet all morning, a thoughtful look on her face that he had learned to recognize as her working up the courage to say something important. "Thomas," she said, setting down the basket of vegetables she had been picking, "I have news." He looked up from where he was repairing a fence post, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "What kind of news?" She smiled, and there was a nervousness in it but also a joy that took his breath away. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." Thomas dropped the hammer he was holding and crossed to her in 3 long strides, sweeping her up into his arms and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" She asked, looking up at him with those storm cloud eyes that he loved so much. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said, and he kissed her with all the love and wonder he felt. "You have given me everything, Zara. A home, a reason to live, and now a family. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I am grateful every single day." The pregnancy was not easy. Zara was sick in the mornings and exhausted in the evenings, and there were days when she could barely keep food down. But she faced it with the same strength and determination she had shown in recovering from her wounds. And Thomas did everything he could to make her comfortable. He took over most of the chores, worked twice as hard to keep the homestead running, and spent his evenings rubbing her back and reading to her from the books she loved. Dr. Emerson came out to the cabin several times to check on her, and he assured them that everything was progressing normally, that the sickness and exhaustion were to be expected. "She is strong," he told Thomas. "She has been through worse and come out the other side. She will be fine." Thomas wanted to believe him, but he could not quite shake the fear that something would go wrong, that he would lose her after finally finding her. He had nightmares sometimes, dreams of that first day when she had been so close to death, and he would wake up in a cold sweat and reach for her, needing to feel her beside him, alive and warm and real. Zara understood his fear without him having to explain it. "I am not going anywhere," she would tell him, holding his hand in the darkness. "I survived bandits and bullets, and I am going to survive this too. We are going to have this baby, and we are going to raise him or her together, and we are going to grow old on this land we have built together. I promise you, Thomas." And he believed her, because she had never lied to him, not once. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1878, with Dr. Emerson and the midwife from town in attendance. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thomas thought he might lose his mind from the fear and helplessness of waiting. But Zara was fierce and strong, and when the baby finally came, his lusty cry filling the cabin, Thomas felt something inside him break open, a flood of love so intense it almost brought him to his knees. "It is a boy," Dr. Emerson said, handing the tiny, squalling bundle to Zara. "A healthy baby boy." Zara looked down at their son with tears streaming down her face, and then she looked up at Thomas with a smile that made him fall in love with her all over again. "He is perfect," she whispered. Thomas moved to the bed and sat beside her, wrapping his arms around both of them. The baby was small and red-faced and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. "What should we name him?" Thomas asked. Zara thought for a moment, and then she said, "James. James Henry Whitmore, after my father and my first husband. They both deserve to be remembered." Thomas felt a lump in his throat at her generosity, at the way she could honor her past while building a future with him. "James it is," he said, and he kissed her forehead. "Thank you, Zara. For him, for us, for everything." Life with a baby was exhausting and chaotic and wonderful. James was a good baby for the most part, but he had strong lungs and a will to match his mother's, and there were many sleepless nights in those first few months. Thomas learned to change diapers and warm bottles, to rock the baby to sleep, while Zara caught a few hours of rest. They took turns walking the floor with James when he was fussy, and they marveled together at every small milestone, every smile and coo and tiny achievement. The homestead continued to grow as well. Thomas expanded the herd, bought a few chickens, and even acquired a milk cow that Zara named Buttercup. They built a small barn to house the animals, and Thomas started hiring on for work at some of the larger ranches nearby, bringing in extra money to support the family. Zara started a small school in Desdemona, teaching the children of the town a few days a week. She had missed teaching, missed the feeling of shaping young minds, and she loved the work. Thomas would watch her sometimes, standing in front of the small class with James in a basket at her feet, and he would feel a surge of pride and love so strong it almost overwhelmed him. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of James's growth. He took his first steps on a sunny spring day when he was just over a year old, toddling from Zara's arms to Thomas's, with a look of determination on his face. He said his first word, "Papa," shortly after, and Thomas carried him around on his shoulders for the rest of the day, grinning like a fool. When James was 3, Zara became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. She was sick for a few weeks, but nothing like the first time, and she continued teaching almost until the day she gave birth. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1881, a tiny, perfect girl with Thomas's blue eyes and Zara's dark hair. "What should we name her?" Thomas asked, holding his daughter with the same awe and wonder he had felt with James. "Rose," Zara said without hesitation. "Rose Marie Whitmore, because she is as beautiful as a flower, and because I want her to have something soft and lovely in a world that can be so hard." Rose was a quieter baby than James had been, more content to watch the world with wide, curious eyes. James was fascinated by his little sister, insisting on helping with everything, from feeding her to rocking her to sleep. Thomas and Zara watched their children together with a gratitude that never faded, knowing how easily things could have been different, how close they had both come to never having this life at all. The homestead continued to prosper. Thomas was making a name for himself as a skilled cattleman, and other ranchers sought his advice and his help. Zara's school grew, and she became known throughout the area as an excellent teacher, patient and kind but also firm when needed. They built an addition onto the cabin, adding 2 small bedrooms for the children, and Thomas started talking about building a proper house, something bigger and more permanent. "I want to build you a house with a real kitchen," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching James and Rose play in the yard. "And a parlor where you can have your books, and bedrooms for the children that do not feel like closets." Zara smiled and took his hand. "I would love that. But even if we stay in this cabin forever, I will be happy, because I have you and the children, and that is all I need." Thomas squeezed her hand, thinking about how far they had both come. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked quietly. "The day the wagon brought you here?" "Every day," she said, her voice soft. "I think about how close I came to dying, to never having any of this. And I think about you standing there in the doorway, a stranger who decided to help me even though you did not have to. You saved my life that day, Thomas, in more ways than one." "You saved mine too," he said, pulling her close. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions but not really living. You gave me a reason to live again. You and the children, you are everything to me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. James was showing Rose how to catch fireflies, his small hands cupped carefully around the glowing insects before he let them go. It was a perfect moment, one of thousands they had shared and would continue to share. As the children grew older, the homestead became a place of laughter and life. James grew into a sturdy, serious boy with his father's work ethic and his mother's intelligence. He loved the cattle and the horses, and he would spend hours following Thomas around, asking questions and learning everything he could about ranching. Rose was more like her mother, with a love of books and learning that made Zara's heart sing. She started attending her mother's school as soon as she was old enough, and she proved to be a bright and eager student. Thomas and Zara made sure their children knew the story of how they had come together, though they softened some of the harsher details. They wanted James and Rose to understand that life could be hard and unfair, but that love and perseverance could overcome even the worst circumstances. "Your mother was very brave," Thomas would tell them. "She went through something terrible, but she did not give up. She fought to live, and she taught me to fight for what I wanted too. And your father was my hero," Zara would add. He took care of me when I had no one, and he showed me what real love looks like. Not the fairy tale kind, but the kind that is steady and true and lasts a lifetime. The children listened with wide eyes, and they grew up understanding that their parents had built something special, something worth protecting and cherishing. In the spring of 1887, Thomas finally started building the house he had promised Zara. It took him nearly 2 years, working in every spare moment he had, and he enlisted the help of neighbors and friends to get it done. The house was 2 stories, with a real kitchen and a parlor and 4 bedrooms, far more space than they strictly needed but room to grow if they wanted. When it was finished, Thomas carried Zara over the threshold while the children cheered and their neighbors applauded. Zara had tears in her eyes as she looked around at the beautiful home Thomas had built for her, at the care and love that had gone into every detail. "It is perfect," she said, turning to him with a smile that still made his heart skip a beat after all these years. "Thank you, Thomas. Thank you," he replied, pulling her close, "for saying yes all those years ago, for building this life with me, for being my partner in everything." They settled into the new house with joy and gratitude. Zara filled the parlor with books and comfortable chairs, creating a space where the family could gather in the evenings. The kitchen was her domain, and she loved the luxury of having a real stove and plenty of counter space. James and Rose each had their own bedrooms, though Rose still sometimes crept into James's room at night when she had bad dreams. The homestead continued to grow and thrive. Thomas's herd had grown to over 100 head of cattle, and he was able to hire help during the busy seasons. Zara's school had become an institution in Desdemona, and she had taught nearly every child in the area at one point or another. They were respected members of the community, known for their hard work and their generosity. But more than that, they were known for the love they had for each other, a love that had been forged in the fire of hardship and had only grown stronger over the years. People would see them together, working side by side or sitting on their porch in the evenings, and they would smile, knowing that they were seeing something rare and precious. James grew into a tall, broad-shouldered young man with his father's quiet strength and his mother's sharp mind. He took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch as Thomas got older, and he proved to be a natural leader. When he was 22, he married a girl from town named Zara, and they built a small house on the edge of the property, close enough to help but far enough to have their own space. Rose became a teacher like her mother, taking over Zara's school when Zara decided to retire at the age of 50. She was gifted with children, patient and creative, and she brought new ideas and methods to the classroom. She married at 25 to a lawyer named Michael who had moved to Desdemona from Dallas, and they had 3 children who adored their grandparents. Thomas and Zara grew old together on the land they had built. They watched their grandchildren run through the same fields where their own children had played. They sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset, just as they had done for decades. Their hair turned gray, their bodies slowed, but their love for each other never dimmed. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Zara back to the spot where he had first seen her, where the wagon had stopped on that dusty road all those years ago. The road was better now, more traveled, but the landscape was much the same. "You remember?" he asked, his voice rougher with age but still warm. "I remember everything," Zara said, leaning into him. "I remember the pain and the fear, but mostly I remember looking up and seeing you, this stranger with kind eyes who refused to let me die. I remember thinking, even through the pain, that maybe there was a reason I was still alive." "There was a reason," Thomas said, kissing her temple. "We had to find each other. We had to build this life together." Everything that happened, All the pain and the struggle, it was worth it to get to this moment, to have had these years with you." Zara looked up at him, and her eyes were still that same storm cloud gray, still full of fire and spirit. "We mended each other," she said softly. "Just like you said we would that first day. I was broken and you were lonely, and somehow we found a way to heal together." "We did," Thomas agreed. "And I would do it all again, every hard day and every struggle, just to have this, just to have you." They stood there for a long time, two people who had been given a second chance and had made the most of it. They had built a life full of love and family and purpose, and they had done it together. Thomas and Zara lived well into their 70s, a remarkable age for the time and place. They saw their grandchildren grow and start families of their own. They saw the homestead expand into one of the most successful ranches in the area. They saw Desdemona grow from a small frontier town into a thriving community. But more than any of that, they saw each other, every single day, with the same love and gratitude they had felt from the beginning. They never forgot where they had come from, never took for granted the miracle of having found each other. When Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, Zara held his hand and whispered all the things she had told him 1,000 times before. She told him she loved him, that he had been the best man she had ever known, that he had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. And she thanked him, one last time, for seeing her that day, broken and bleeding, and choosing to save her. Zara lived 2 more years after Thomas died, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her days in the house Thomas had built for her, in the parlor full of books, and she wrote down their story so that future generations would know where they had come from and what their love had overcome. When she passed, she was buried beside Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky as wide and open as the one they had gazed at together for so many years. The headstone was simple, with both their names and the dates of their births and deaths. But underneath, at Zara's instruction, was carved a single line: "They mended each other." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through James and his children, and then through his grandchildren. The story of Thomas and Zara became a part of the family lore, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. The children grew up knowing that their family had been built on a foundation of love and second chances, that even in the hardest times, there was hope. The house Thomas built still stands, well maintained by generations of his descendants. The porch where Thomas and Zara sat on so many evenings is still there, and on summer nights, you can almost imagine seeing them there, 2 figures in the twilight, holding hands and watching the sunset. Desdemona itself changed over the years, growing and modernizing, but the story of the cowboy and the woman the wagon brought to him remained. It became part of the town's history, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected places, that love can bloom even in the harshest soil, and that 2 broken people can create something whole and beautiful when they find each other. James's oldest son, Thomas James Whitmore, named for both his grandfather and father, took over the ranch in his turn and expanded it further. He married and had children, and he made sure they knew the story of their great-grandparents, the foundation upon which everything had been built. Rose's daughter, named Zara Rose after both her grandmother and mother, became a writer and eventually published a book about Thomas and Zara's story. It was a small publication, mostly distributed locally, but it preserved the details and the love story for anyone who wanted to read it. The book became a cherished possession in many homes in the area, a reminder of what true love looked like. The land that Thomas had claimed and built upon continued to thrive. The cattle business that he had started grew into a major operation, employing dozens of people and contributing significantly to the local economy. But the family never forgot that it had started with one man who was lonely and broken, and one woman who was bleeding and dying, and a choice to help, to care, to love. On the 100th anniversary of Thomas and Zara's meeting, the family gathered at the ranch for a reunion. There were nearly 200 descendants by then, spread across Texas and beyond, but they came back to the home place to celebrate and remember. They stood on that same hill where Thomas and Zara were buried, and someone read from Zara's book, telling the story of how it all began. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the family gathered on the porch of the old house. The great-great-grandchildren ran in the yard, just as James and Rose had done so many years before. The adults talked and laughed, sharing stories and memories. And through it all, there was a sense of connection, of continuity, of belonging to something larger than themselves. Because Thomas and Zara had not just built a ranch or raised a family. They had created a legacy of love, a testament to the power of choosing life over death, hope over despair, connection over loneliness. They had shown that it was possible to take the broken pieces of a life and forge them into something beautiful and lasting. The story of the wagon that brought her, bleeding and broken, to the lonely cowboy who said he would mend her if she would mend him, was more than just a romantic tale. It was a truth about the human spirit, about resilience and second chances and the transformative power of love. It was about two people who had every reason to give up but chose instead to fight for something better, something worth living for. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy they left behind. Not the land or the ranch or the money, but the knowledge that love, real love, could overcome anything. That two broken souls could find each other in the vast wilderness of the world and create something whole and beautiful. That a wagon bringing a dying woman to a stranger's door could be the beginning of a story that would echo through generations. Thomas and Zara Whitmore had lived and loved and built something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. They had mended each other, and in doing so, they had created a family, a home, and a love story that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. As the stars came out over the Texas landscape that night, over the ranch and the house and the hill where two people rested side by side, there was a sense of peace and completion. The story that had begun with blood and pain and desperation had ended with love and family and a legacy that would endure. And somewhere in whatever comes after, Thomas and Zara were together still, their hands clasped, their love eternal, forever mending each other in the way that only two souls truly meant for each other can.